William stood at the window of Adelaide Cottage, watching the morning mist roll across the Windsor grounds. The phone call from Balmoral had come at dawn, and, even now, 3 hours later, his hand still trembled slightly. Kate found him there, still in the same position she had left him in when she went to prepare the children's breakfast. "The children are asking questions," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "George keeps wondering why we're not going to school today." William turned to face his wife, and Kate saw something in his eyes she had rarely seen before, a vulnerability that reminded her of the young man she had met at university before the weight of royal duty had settled permanently on his shoulders. They both knew this day would come eventually, but nothing could have prepared them for the reality of it. "We need to tell them," William said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how to explain that their great-grandmother won't be coming to tea anymore." The Queen's decline had been gradual, then sudden. Just 2 days ago, she had been well enough to meet with the new Prime Minister. Now, the doctors at Balmoral were speaking in hushed tones about hours, not days. The family was gathering, but William and Kate faced a unique challenge: how to help 3 young children understand that the woman they knew simply as Gone was preparing to leave them forever. Kate moved closer to her husband, taking his hand in hers. After 12 years of marriage, she could read every emotion that crossed his face. This wasn't just about losing a grandmother. This was about losing the anchor that had held the monarchy steady for 7 decades, and about William suddenly finding himself much closer to a throne he wasn't sure he was ready for. "Do you remember what she told you when George was born?" Kate asked, trying to bring comfort through shared memory. "She said that being a grandparent was different from being a parent, that she could finally just enjoy the children without worrying about preparing them for duty." William nodded, a small smile briefly crossing his face. The Queen had indeed seemed different with his children than the stories he had heard about her own parenting style. With George, Charlotte, and Louis, she had been simply a great-grandmother who delighted in their drawings and listened patiently to their chatter about school friends and playground adventures. The sound of footsteps on the stairs interrupted their quiet moment. Charlotte appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep. At 7 years old, she possessed an intuitive understanding that often surprised the adults around her. "Mummy, why does Papa look sad?" she asked, climbing onto the window seat beside her parents. "And why isn't Gone coming to see us this weekend like she promised?" Kate and William exchanged a look. They had agreed years ago that they would always be honest with their children, but this conversation would test that commitment in ways they had never imagined. How do you tell a child that someone they love is dying? How do you explain death itself to young minds that see the world as permanent and unchanging? William knelt down to Charlotte's level, his training in public speaking temporarily forgotten as he struggled to find the right words for his daughter. "Charlotte, do you remember when Lupo got very sick last year, and we had to take him to the special doctor for animals?" Charlotte nodded solemnly. Their Cocker Spaniel had recovered, but she remembered the worried conversations between her parents and the sadness that had filled the house for several days. "Well, sometimes when people get very old, their bodies get tired, just like Lupo's did. And sometimes, even with the best doctors helping, they can't get better," William continued, his voice steady despite the emotion building behind his words. Gone is very, very old, and she's gotten very tired. The doctors are taking care of her, but they think she might need to go to sleep for a very long time." Charlotte considered this, her young mind working to process information that adults struggle to understand. "Will she dream nice dreams?" she asked finally. The question caught both parents off guard. Kate felt tears spring to her eyes, not just for the innocence of the question, but for the wisdom contained within it. Even at 7, Charlotte seemed to understand that this sleep would be different from the bedtime sleep she knew. "I think she'll dream about all the happy times she had with people she loved," Kate answered, pulling Charlotte onto her lap. "She'll dream about her dogs, and her horses, and all the wonderful places she visited. And I think she'll dream about you, and George and Louis, and how proud she was to be your great-grandmother." As if summoned by the mention of his name, George appeared in the doorway. At 9, he was old enough to sense the gravity of the situation, though he didn't fully understand it. Behind him, 3-year-old Louis clutched his favorite stuffed animal, confused by the unusual atmosphere in their normally cheerful home. William looked at his 3 children, the future of the monarchy sitting in pajamas on a window seat, and felt the full weight of what was happening. In losing the Queen, they weren't just losing a family member. They were losing the woman who had shown them that duty and love could coexist, that being royal didn't mean being distant, and that sometimes the most important conversations happen not in palaces or staterooms, but in quiet moments like this one. The phone rang again. This time, it was Charles calling with an update from Scotland. As William stepped away to take the call, Kate gathered the three children closer, knowing that their childhood was about to change in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The fairy tale version of royal life that they had known, where great-grandmother was simply a loving figure who remembered their birthdays and listened to their stories, was about to become something much more complex and demanding. Outside, the mist was lifting from the grounds, revealing the clear autumn morning beneath. Inside Adelaide Cottage, a family was beginning to navigate the most difficult goodbye of their lives, knowing that when it was over, everything would be different. The children's questions would become harder to answer, their father's responsibilities would multiply exponentially, and the woman who had guided the family through decades of change would exist only in memories and official portraits. But, for now, in this moment, they were still just a family facing loss together, holding each other close as they prepared to say farewell to someone irreplaceable. The helicopter journey to Scotland felt longer than usual, despite covering the familiar route in record time. Kate sat beside William, watching the landscape blur beneath them while their children dozed fitfully in their seats. The pilot had been instructed to maintain radio silence except for essential communications, adding an eerie quality to what should have been a routine flight. William's phone buzzed constantly with encrypted messages from various family members, government officials, and palace staff. Kate could see him reading each one, his expression growing more strained with every update. She knew without asking that the news wasn't improving. When Harry's message appeared on the screen, a simple, "I'm on my way from California," William's jaw tightened in a way that told Kate everything she needed to know about the urgency of the situation. "Will Uncle Harry make it in time?" George asked quietly, having noticed his father's reaction to the phone. Despite their parents' efforts to shield them from adult concerns, their eldest son had always been remarkably perceptive about family dynamics. "I hope so," William answered honestly. "Uncle Harry loved Gongon very much, just like we do. Sometimes when someone is very sick, people travel very far to be with them." The truth was more complicated than William could explain to a 9-year-old. Harry's relationship with the family had been strained for years, ever since he and Meghan had stepped back from royal duties and moved to America. There had been attempts at reconciliation, brief moments of hope, but the distance remained. Now, with their grandmother's life hanging in the balance, all of that seemed trivial. Family disagreements felt insignificant when measured against the reality of permanent loss. Kate reached over and squeezed William's hand. She had watched him struggle with the rift between him and his brother for years, seeing how it weighed on him even when he tried to hide it. The Queen had always been the family's anchor, the one person who could bring everyone together regardless of their differences. Her imminent passing meant losing not just a grandmother, but potentially the last real connection between the brothers. As they flew over the Scottish Highlands, Kate remembered her first visit to Balmoral as William's girlfriend, terrified that she would say something wrong or use the wrong fork at dinner. The Queen had put her at ease immediately, asking about her photography studies and listening with genuine interest to her answers. Over the years, their relationship had evolved from polite formality to something resembling genuine affection, built on shared concern for William and the children. "I'm scared," Charlotte whispered, moving from her seat to curl up next to her mother. "What if Gongon doesn't recognize us when we see her?" It was a fear that Kate shared but hadn't voiced. The doctors had warned them that the Queen was drifting in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid and sometimes lost in memories from decades past. The possibility that their final conversation might be with someone who no longer knew them was heartbreaking to contemplate. "Even if Gongon seems confused, she still loves you," Kate assured her daughter. "Love doesn't disappear just because someone is sick. It stays in their heart, even when other things become hard to remember." The helicopter began its descent toward Balmoral, the castle's familiar towers coming into view through the clouds. Kate could see cars lined up in the circular drive. Other family members had already arrived. The sight of so many vehicles suggested that this gathering might indeed be the final one. William's phone rang as they touched down. Charles's voice was strained when William answered, though he tried to keep his tone measured for the sake of the listening children. "She's been asking for everyone," he said simply. "The doctor says we should prepare ourselves." As they disembarked from the helicopter, Kate felt the weight of history settling around them. Balmoral had always been the Queen's favorite residence, the place where she could escape the formalities of court life and simply be a wife, mother, and grandmother. It seemed fitting that this final chapter would unfold here, surrounded by the Scottish landscape she had loved for more than 8 decades, and met them at the entrance, her usual brisk efficiency softened by obvious emotion. "She's resting now," she told William, "but she's been alert enough to ask about each of you specifically. She wants to see the children, but we should prepare them for how different she might seem." The children clustered closer to their parents as they entered the castle. The familiar halls felt different somehow, charged with an atmosphere of anticipation and sorrow that even young Lewis could sense. Staff members moved quietly through the corridors, their usual cheerful greetings replaced by respectful nods and whispered updates. In the drawing room, other family members were gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices. Edward and Sophie sat with their children, while Andrew stood alone by the window, staring out at the grounds. The atmosphere was unlike any family gathering they had experienced before, formal yet intimate, public yet deeply private. Kate noticed that despite the serious circumstances, the children were taking comfort in being surrounded by their extended family. George gravitated toward his older cousins, while Charlotte found herself drawn to Zara, who had always had a special way with children. Even little Lewis seemed to understand that this was a time for staying close to the adults and speaking quietly. "Has anyone heard from Harry?" William asked his father quietly. Charles shook his head. His flight was delayed, leaving Los Angeles. "The earliest he can arrive is late tonight, and that's if everything goes perfectly." William felt a familiar pang of frustration mixed with sadness. Despite their differences, this was a moment when family should be together. The thought that Harry might miss these final hours because of flight schedules and time zones seemed particularly cruel. Dr. Morrison, the Queen's personal physician, emerged from the private quarters and approached Charles. Their brief conversation was conducted in whispers, but Kate could read the gravity in both men's expressions. When the doctor left, Charles gathered his immediate family around him. "She's awake and comfortable," he said softly. "She's asked to see each family group separately, starting with William and his family. She tires easily, so we'll need to keep the visits brief, but she's been very clear about wanting to speak with everyone." Kate felt her heart rate accelerate. Despite all their preparation, the reality of walking into that room and having what might be their final conversation with the Queen felt overwhelming. She looked down at her children, trying to project calm while internally grappling with her own grief and fear. William knelt down to address George, Charlotte, and Lewis directly. "When we go in to see Gongon, she might look different than usual," he explained gently. "She's very tired, and she's been sick, so she might be lying in bed instead of sitting in her favorite chair. But she's still the same person who loves you very much and wants to hear about what you've been doing. Can we tell her about our school play?" Charlotte asked. "She was supposed to come watch it next week." "I think she would love to hear about the play," William answered, his voice thick with emotion. "She always loved hearing about your school activities." A gentle knock on the drawing room door indicated that they were being summoned. As they prepared to walk down the familiar hallway toward the Queen's private sitting room, Kate took William's hand in one of hers and Charlotte's in the other. George reached for his father's other hand, and William lifted Lewis into his arms. Together, they walked toward what they all understood would be one of the most important conversations of their lives. The hallway seemed longer than usual, each step bringing them closer to a goodbye that would change everything. Behind them, the rest of the family waited their turn, each lost in their own memories and fears. Ahead, behind a door they had walked through hundreds of times before, waited a woman who had been the constant in all their lives, preparing to leave them forever. The Queen's sitting room had been transformed into something resembling a peaceful bedroom, with medical equipment discreetly positioned behind screens and fresh flowers from the Balmoral gardens filling every available surface. Despite the circumstances, the room still felt unmistakably like her personal space. Photographs of family members covered the side tables, her favorite books were stacked nearby, and her beloved corgis dozed quietly in their usual spots by the fireplace. She was awake when they entered, propped up against pillows and wearing a soft blue cardigan that Kate recognized from countless informal family gatherings. Her face lit up when she saw the children, and, for a moment, she looked exactly like the grandmother they had always known. "My dear ones," she said, her voice quieter than usual but still carrying the warmth that had always made the children feel special. "Come and Tell me what adventures you've been having. Charlotte was the first to approach the bed, her natural confidence overriding any nervousness she might have felt. Gone. We're doing a play at school about the Romans, and I get to be a centurion. I have a helmet and everything. The queen's eyes sparkled with genuine delight. A centurion? How wonderful. You must practice your marching for me. Romans were known for their excellent marching, you know. Kate watched as Charlotte immediately began demonstrating her stage marching around the room, her serious expression making the adults smile despite the gravity of the situation. It was exactly the kind of interaction that the queen had always cherished with her great-grandchildren, natural, unforced, and focused entirely on their world rather than the adult concerns that usually dominated royal conversations. George approached more hesitantly, old enough to understand that this visit was different from their usual tea times. We've been learning about World War II in school, he said carefully. My teacher said you were very young when it started. I was indeed, the queen replied, patting the bed beside her to encourage him to sit closer. I was not much older than you are now when the war began. It was a frightening time, but also a time when people discovered how strong they could be when they worked together. William listened to his grandmother speaking with his children and felt the familiar mixture of admiration and sadness that had characterized his feelings about her for years. Even now, facing the end of her life, she was still teaching, still finding ways to connect her experiences to their young understanding of the world. Louis, still in William's arms, had been unusually quiet throughout the interaction. Finally, he pointed at the medical equipment visible behind the screens and asked in his 3-year-old directness, Gone have owies? The question hung in the air for a moment before the queen answered with characteristic honesty. Yes, darling, I do have some owies. Sometimes when people get very old, their bodies don't work as well as they used to. But the doctors are taking very good care of me, and it doesn't hurt very much. Kate felt tears threatening as she watched her youngest son process this information. At 3, Louis's understanding of mortality was limited, but he seemed to grasp that his great-grandmother was somehow different than usual. Kiss better, he asked, leaning toward her from his father's arms. The queen's composure wavered for the first time since they had entered the room. That would be lovely, she whispered. William carried Louis closer to the bed, and his youngest son gently kissed his great-grandmother's cheek with the solemnity that children sometimes display when they sense the importance of a moment they don't fully understand. Now then, the queen said, collecting herself, I want each of you to remember something very important. Being part of this family means taking care of each other, especially when things become difficult. George, you're the eldest, and that means looking out for your sister and brother. Charlotte, you're clever and brave, and sometimes you'll need to help your brother George remember to be kind as well as strong. And, Louis, you'll always be the baby, even when you're all grown up, and that's a special job too. She turned to address William and Kate directly. They're extraordinary children, she said simply. You've done well. The words carried weight beyond a typical grandmotherly compliment. Kate understood that this was the queen's way of expressing approval not just for their parenting, but for how they had navigated the complex challenges of raising royal children who were also just ordinary kids in many ways. We've had an excellent teacher, William replied, his voice rough with emotion. Everything we know about balancing duty and family, we learned from watching you. A comfortable silence settled over the room as the queen closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength for what she wanted to say next. When she opened them again, her gaze was focused and intent. William, she said, walk with me to the window. There's something I want to show you. Despite her obvious weakness, she insisted on getting up from the bed with William's help. Kate gathered the children onto the small sofa nearby, understanding instinctively that this was a moment meant for grandmother and grandson alone. At the window, the queen pointed out toward the grounds where she had walked with William countless times during his childhood visits to Balmoral. Do you see that old oak tree by the stream? She asked. I planted that with your grandfather when we were first married. It was just a sapling then, barely higher than my waist. William followed her gaze to the massive tree that now dominated that section of the landscape. He remembered climbing in its branches as a child, never knowing the story of its beginning. 65 years later, it provides shade for picnics and homes for countless birds, she continued. That's what a life well lived looks like. You plant something small and tend it carefully, and eventually it becomes something much larger than what you started with. The metaphor wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. William understood that she was talking about the monarchy, about the work she had done to strengthen and modernize an ancient institution, and about the responsibility that would soon pass to his father and eventually to him. "I'm not ready," he admitted quietly, voicing a fear he had never spoken aloud before. "No one ever is," she replied. "I certainly wasn't when I was 25 and, suddenly, found myself queen. But readiness isn't the same as capability. You have good judgment, a strong marriage, and 3 children who will keep you grounded in what really matters. That's more than many kings have started with." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the Scottish landscape that had provided backdrop to some of their most important conversations over the years. Kate observed them from across the room, memorizing the sight of her husband, receiving final guidance from the woman who had shaped his understanding of duty and service. When they returned to the seating area, the Queen had one more request. "I'd like to hear you all sing something together," she said. "Choose whatever you like, a hymn, a song from school, anything that makes you happy." The children looked at each other uncertainly before Charlotte suggested "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," a song they often sang together during car trips. Their voices blended softly in the quiet room, with Kate and William eventually joining in. The Queen closed her eyes and smiled, her expression peaceful and content. When the song ended, she opened her eyes and looked at each family member individually, as if memorizing their faces. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Kate understood that this was goodbye, even though no one had said the word. As they prepared to leave and give other family members their turn, she felt the finality of the moment settling over them all. The next time they saw the Queen, if there was a next time, it might be very different. At the door, William turned back one more time. "Grandmother," he said, "thank you for showing us how to do this." "You already know how," she replied. "You always have." As they walked back down the hallway toward the drawing room where the rest of the family waited, Kate could see that William was struggling to maintain his composure. The children were unusually quiet, each processing the visit in their own way. Behind them, the door closed softly, and they could hear and Timothy being welcomed into the room for their private farewell. The weight of what had just occurred was beginning to settle over all of them. They had received not just a grandmother's love, but a monarch's final blessing, and the responsibility that came with both would stay with them forever. The hours that followed felt suspended in time, as if the normal rules of day and night had been temporarily abandoned. Family members moved quietly through the castle's corridors, gathering in small groups to share memories and provide comfort to one another. The children, initially overwhelmed by the unusual atmosphere, had gradually settled into the rhythm of this strange day, finding ways to occupy themselves while the adults maintained their careful vigil. Kate found herself in the role she often assumed during family gatherings, the one who noticed when someone needed tea, when the children required quiet activities, or when a cousin needed someone to listen to their concerns. But today, that role felt more significant somehow. She was acutely aware that she was witnessing the end of an era, and that her own position within the family was about to shift dramatically. William had become increasingly quiet as the day progressed, moving between conversations with various family members and periods of solitary reflection. Kate could see him processing not just the immediate grief of losing his grandmother, but the weight of what her passing would mean for his future. The theoretical discussions about succession that had taken place over the years were about to become reality. As evening approached, Dr. Morrison emerged from the Queen's quarters more frequently, each consultation with Charles growing longer and more serious. The family began to understand without being explicitly told that they were now counting hours rather than days. Harry's arrival just after sunset brought a moment of bittersweet relief. His plane had been delayed multiple times, and there had been genuine concern that he would miss these final moments entirely. When he walked into the drawing room, travel-worn and exhausted, the family's dynamics shifted subtly. Despite years of tension and public disagreements, his presence felt essential for this farewell. William approached his brother immediately, and Kate watched as they embraced without the stiffness that had characterized their interactions in recent years. Grief, it seemed, had a way of stripping away everything except what truly mattered. "Has she been asking for me?" Harry asked quietly. "Every few hours," William replied honestly. "She'll be so relieved that you made it." Kate observed the exchange with cautious hope. The Queen had always been the bridge between her grandsons when their relationship became strained. Perhaps even in her final hours, she could help them find their way back to each other. The children's reunion with their uncle provided a brief moment of normalcy in the increasingly surreal day. Harry's ability to connect with them had never wavered, regardless of family tensions. And soon Louis was attempting to show him every toy he had brought from home, while Charlotte recounted her school play in elaborate detail. But even the children's chatter couldn't completely mask the underlying tension in the room. Everyone was waiting for news that no one wanted to receive, holding on to hope while simultaneously trying to prepare for the inevitable. As night fell, Charles made the decision that many families face in similar circumstances, whether to try to maintain normal routines for the children or to acknowledge that this night would be unlike any other. After consulting with William and Kate, they chose a middle path. The children would have dinner and their usual bedtime routine, but they would sleep in rooms close to their parents, and they would be awakened if the situation changed during the night. Kate helped settle the children in the nursery wing, reading extra stories and providing additional reassurance. Their questions had evolved throughout the day from curiosity about their great-grandmother's condition to deeper concerns about what would happen next. "Will Papa have to be the king now?" George asked as Kate tucked him into bed. It was a question that Kate had been dreading, partly because she wasn't entirely sure of the answer herself. The line of succession was clear, but the timing and process were more complex than most people realized. "Grandpa Charles will be king first," she explained carefully. "Papa won't be king for a very long time, not until he's much older. But, yes, someday, when you're grown up with children of your own, Papa will have that job." George considered this soberly. "Will we have to move to a different house?" "We might, eventually," Kate answered honestly. "But not right away, and when we do, we'll all be together. Houses can change, but families stay the same." Charlotte, listening from the adjoining bed, had a different concern. "Will people expect us to be different now?" The question caught Kate off guard with its perceptiveness. At 7, Charlotte was already beginning to understand that their lives were more public than those of her school friends, and that expectations would only increase as she grew older. "People might pay more attention to us," Kate acknowledged. "But the most important thing is that we continue to be kind, honest, and caring toward others." Gongon always said that how we treat people matters more than any title we might have. After the children were settled, Kate found William on one of Balmoral's terraces, staring out at the Scottish landscape under a clear, star-filled sky. The night air was crisp, carrying the scent of heather and the distant sound of the River Dee flowing through the grounds. "I keep thinking about all the conversations we never had," he said when she joined him. "All the questions I should have asked while there was still time." Kate slipped her arm through his, understanding the regret that was coloring his grief. "She knew you loved her," she said simply. "Everything else was just details." "I wish that were true," William replied. "But there's so much about being king that I don't understand. The constitutional aspects, the relationship with Parliament, how to balance tradition with necessary change." She lived through so much: the end of the Empire, the Cold War, the emergence of social media, Brexit. "How am I supposed to navigate challenges I can't even imagine yet?" It was rare for William to voice his fears so directly, even to Kate. Usually, he processed his concerns privately before presenting a composed exterior to the world. The approaching magnitude of his future responsibilities was clearly overwhelming him. "You won't be doing it alone," Kate reminded him. "You'll have your father's experience to draw on, excellent advisors, and a family that supports you. And you have something that not every monarch has had. You've seen both the benefits and the costs of this life, and you've chosen it anyway." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by a gentle tap on the terrace door, and appeared, her expression grave but composed. "You should come inside," she said simply. "All of you." As they walked back through the castle's corridors, Kate could hear other family members being quietly summoned from various rooms. The time they had all been anticipating had finally arrived. Staff members moved efficiently but respectfully, ensuring that everyone who needed to be present could gather in the Queen's sitting room. The room felt different now, charged with an expectancy that made every sound seem amplified. The Queen lay peacefully, her breathing shallow but steady, surrounded by the people who had shared her life. Charles sat beside the bed holding her hand, while other family members arranged themselves around the room according to relationships and protocol that had been established over decades. Kate positioned herself where she could see both the Queen and her own children, who had been awakened and brought down in their pajamas. They seemed to understand instinctively that this was a moment requiring silence and respect. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who had arrived earlier in the evening, spoke softly about peace and eternal rest. His words were comforting rather than formal, acknowledging both the public figure and the private woman who had touched so many lives. In the quiet that followed, with only the soft sounds of breathing and the distant ticking of an antique clock marking time, Kate realized she was witnessing the end of the longest reign in British history. The woman who had been a constant presence for generations was preparing to leave them, surrounded by love and respect, in the place she had always considered home. The weight of what would follow, the protocols, the ceremonies, the transition of power, seemed impossibly heavy. But for now, in this peaceful room filled with family, there was only the simple human experience of saying goodbye to someone irreplaceable. The Queen passed peacefully at 6:30 in the evening, with her family surrounding her, and the Scottish sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and purple beyond the windows. Her breathing simply became quieter and then stopped, so gently that for a moment, no one was entirely certain that the end had come. Dr. Morrison confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts, and then there was silence. In that silence, Kate watched as the weight of history settled on Charles's shoulders. He was no longer the Prince of Wales waiting for his destiny. He was now King Charles III, with all the responsibility and symbolism that the title carried. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, visible in the way he straightened his shoulders and the careful composure that replaced his grief-stricken expression. William's own transformation was less immediate but equally significant. In losing his grandmother, he had moved dramatically closer to his own eventual role as monarch. The theoretical future that had always seemed distant was suddenly much more real and much more imminent. The children reacted to the moment, each in their own way. George remained perfectly still, his 9-year-old mind working to process what he had just witnessed. Charlotte moved closer to her mother, seeking comfort without fully understanding what she needed comfort for. Louis, tired from the long day and confused by the adult emotions surrounding him, simply asked if they could go home now. The immediate aftermath was handled with the precision that comes from years of preparation. Phone calls were made to government officials, Commonwealth leaders, and senior palace staff. The protocols that had been rehearsed and refined over decades swung into action, transforming a private family loss into a matter of international significance. But, for a brief time, before the machinery of state funeral planning began, they remained simply a family gathered around someone they had loved and lost, and straightened the Queen's blankets with tender efficiency. Andrew stood quietly by the window, perhaps remembering his mother as the young woman who had worried about him during the Falklands War. Edward held Sophie's hand, both of them thinking about their own children and how to explain this loss. Harry and William found themselves standing together near their grandmother's bed, and Kate saw something pass between them that gave her hope. The crisis had stripped away years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding, leaving only the shared experience of losing someone who had shaped both their lives. "She would have been pleased that you made it," William said quietly to his brother. "She would have been more pleased that we're both here together," Harry replied. It was a small exchange, but Kate recognized its significance. Perhaps their grandmother's death could accomplish what years of attempted reconciliation had failed to achieve, bringing her grandsons back to each other. The practicalities of the situation began to intrude gradually. Decisions needed to be made about timing, about who would be informed first, about how the news would be released to the public. Charles, with advice from senior courtiers who had arrived throughout the evening, began the complex process of managing both private grief and public responsibility. Kate found herself thinking about the children and how to help them understand what would happen next. The death of the Queen would trigger a series of events that would affect their daily lives in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. School routines would be disrupted, family time would be invaded by official obligations, and their father would be called upon to take on new responsibilities that would change their family dynamic. "We should take the children home tonight," she said to William during a brief private moment. "Let them sleep in their own beds, and try to maintain some sense of normalcy while we figure out what comes next." William nodded, understanding that their role as parents needed to take priority, even amid the constitutional and ceremonial obligations that would soon overwhelm their schedules. The children's emotional well-being would require careful attention over the coming weeks as they navigated public mourning while processing their own private grief. The helicopter flight back to Adelaide Cottage took place under a star-filled sky that seemed impossibly peaceful given the magnitude of what had just occurred. The children fell asleep during the journey, exhausted by a day that had asked them to confront concepts far beyond their years. As they carried sleeping children into their familiar home, Kate felt the strange contrast between the momentous historical event they had just witnessed and the ordinary domestic routine of putting tired children to bed. Louis stirred briefly as she tucked him in, asking sleepily if Gon was feeling better now. "She's not sick anymore," Kate answered softly, choosing words that were both truthful and comforting. "She's resting peacefully." It was after midnight when Kate and William finally had a moment alone together. They sat in their kitchen with cups of tea growing cold in front of them, still processing what had happened and what would come next. The phone calls from palace officials would begin again in a few hours, along with meetings about funeral arrangements, speeches to be written, and official statements to be approved. "Everything's different now," William said, voicing what they were both thinking. Kate nodded, understanding that he wasn't just talking about the line of succession or constitutional changes. Their children would grow up with a different relationship to the monarchy than previous generations had experienced. The Queen's death marked the end of an era of stability and continuity that had lasted for more than 70 years. "She prepared us as well as she could," Kate replied. "The rest we'll figure out as we go." Over the following days, as the nation and Commonwealth began the formal process of mourning, Kate watched William struggle with the competing demands of private grief and public duty. The funeral planning required his input on countless details, while media attention made even simple activities like taking the children to school complicated and emotionally fraught. The children handled the disruption with surprising resilience, perhaps because children adapt more easily to change than adults do. George asked thoughtful questions about the funeral ceremony and what his grandfather's new role would mean. Charlotte worried about whether people would expect her to be sad all the time now. Louis simply missed his great-grandmother and asked when they could visit her again. The public response to the Queen's death was overwhelming in its scope and emotion. Flowers piled up outside royal residences, world leaders offered condolences, and ordinary people shared memories of how the Queen had touched their lives. Kate found herself moved by the genuine affection displayed by people who had never met the Queen personally, but felt connected to her through decades of faithful service. As the state funeral approached, Kate realized that this ceremony would mark not just the end of the Queen's life, but the beginning of a new chapter for their own family. William's role would expand significantly, their children would face increased public attention, and her own responsibilities would grow in ways she was still learning to understand. The morning of the funeral dawned clear and crisp, with autumn sunshine streaming through the windows of Westminster Abbey. As Kate helped Charlotte adjust her black coat and checked that George's tie was properly straightened, she thought about all the conversations they would have in the years to come about duty, service, and the balance between public responsibility and private happiness. The Queen had shown them how to carry these burdens with grace and dignity. Now it was their turn to find their own way forward, guided by her example, but shaped by their own understanding of what the monarchy could and should be in the 21st century. As they prepared to leave for the ceremony that would bid farewell to an extraordinary woman and an extraordinary reign, Kate took William's hand and squeezed it gently. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, carrying forward the lessons they had learned about love, duty, and the enduring strength of family bonds that transcend even the most profound loss.